the recording should
I
be.
can just do it. Well, maybe. Let me see if I'm allowed to record.
I think it's going.
Okay.
So everyone who will watch this recording will get to see me tentatively staring at the screen, but it says recording, it's blinking. I am so excited. I see colleagues, I see some of my students, I see friends, I see clergy, I see laity. This is lovely. Okay, well, I have a lot to say, so let's get started. Good evening, everyone. And if you see me pause, it's to let people in on the call, which I will do sort of multitasking. My name, for those of you who don't know me, although I believe about 95% of you do, my name is Ben Hollenbach. I use he and they pronouns, and I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. You might have seen our university in the newspapers lately, either for our COVID response, the lawsuit against our graduate students, or our quarantine housing. We're very famous. And that's the last self-deprecating comment I will make about the University of Michigan, because that's not what we're here to talk about this evening. This evening, we are here to talk about the Bible. We're here to talk about queer liberation, and we're here to talk about inclusivity. These are three topics that matter very deeply to me. They're central to my research. And so I have put together a PowerPoint, and hopefully we can also have some conversation as a group. And without further ado, I will share my screen and begin my presentation. And let me also start the slideshow. My presentation this evening is entitled, I do not think it means what you think it means, rejecting anti-LGBTQ biblical interpretations. I'm going to start by saying something about Chris Pratt. Let me give you some background. Chris Pratt is an American actor. You might have seen him in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, the Jurassic World franchise, or the show Parks and Recreation. He is also an attendee of a church outside Los Angeles called Hillsong. Hillsong is known for, among other things, its vehement anti-LGBTQ politics. After being called out by queer actress Ellen Page for attending this church, Pratt made several remarks about how he nor his church were homophobic and made the following statement, quote, "Despite what the Bible says about divorce, my church community was there for me every step of the way, never judging, just gracefully accompanying me on my walk. They helped me tremendously, offering love and support. It is what I have seen them do for others on countless occasions, regardless of sexual orientation, race, or gender." So here Chris Pratt is saying, essentially, because his church ignored or sort of overlooked anything the Bible said about his own divorce from Anna Faris, which obviously is a sin. Who would divorce Anna Faris? She's amazing. And Chris Pratt is sort of mediocre as actors go. In addition to this, Pratt is making an equivalency between his church welcoming him as a divorced, white, cisgender, straight male, and saying, well, if they can do this, they're obviously also very cool with various sexual orientations and gender identities. I bring this up as a start, first because it's a false equivalency. To say that churches that are welcoming to people who have been divorced means that they're welcoming to queer people is a false equivalency. Because at least in the contemporary United States, biblically attacking queer folks is still done with a lot more intensity and with far more violence behind it than folks who have been divorced. Now, I know everyone in this room is in their 20s or at least their 30s, and no one was born before a certain year. I do know that especially in the early to mid 20th century, a lot of Christian denominations looked very unfavorably on divorce, and there was discrimination. That has, to a degree, evaporated by the year 2020, to the extent that we wouldn't want to compare it to discrimination against queer folks. This is a big book. Now, it's not just because I have the Apocrypha as part of this book that it's a big book. It would be a big book without the Apocrypha. There are over 30,000 verses in this Bible. And of these 30,000 plus verses, there are only 6 generally used against LGBTQ plus people. So again, this book is gigantic. There are many, I stole this from Lord of Light Lutheran Campus Ministry. I promise I will give it back when COVID ends. This has not disappeared, never to return. I just want you to know, since I know that the pastor, council president, and several members of the church now just saw me use a stolen book. My point here is that it's a very small foundation for attack, especially given the vehemence of these attacks and the sort of infrastructure behind wanting to deny queer people places in organized religion and to deny queer people civil rights based on the exegesis or the interpretation of these verses. Before I continue to rant here, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself so that I can justify why I'm telling you this. My qualifications, and here's a picture of me. I was a lot skinnier when that was taken. This was before the COVID weight went on, so enjoy that picture. I am an anthropologist of religion. Anthropologists are scholars of culture. We look at why humans behave the way they do, how they behave in societies, and how these societies look at issues like religion, like gender, like kinship, like politics, like race and ethnicity. I, in particular, am an anthropologist of religion, meaning that I look specifically at religion and religious life. In particular, I study Christianity in the United States, mainline Protestantism to be exact. For my dissertation, I did 2 years of intense research in 3 different Protestant churches here in the state of Michigan, exploring the topic broadly of what it means to be inclusive. This often took the form of queer inclusion, of looking at churches' efforts to welcome LGBTQ plus people. But this topic of inclusivity is obviously wider, it's obviously intersectional. So we're also looking at the ways in which churches grapple with issues surrounding other forms of marginalization in the contemporary United States. My final qualification is that I speak fundamentalist. I'm fluent in this. Apparently, fundamentalist does not fulfill the University of Michigan language requirement. I did try. It did not work. My goals for tonight are fairly broad, but I think we can do it in an hour and a half. I want to first briefly cover the 6 verses that are traditionally used to justify discrimination against queer folks. Again, let's look at the size of the Bible and remember that we're only going to look at 6 verses because there really are only 6 verses. And I want to impress that on you again to make a point of how tenuous this is and on how little evidence so many decades and even centuries of violence and discrimination have been based. Then I want to look at 4 strategies for how to approach these verses. These strategies are based on my 2 years of research in these various congregations. After doing 2 years of participant observation, which means attending events, attending services, attending Bible studies, and really talking with folks in a variety of interview and informal contexts about how they thought of these issues, I discerned these 4 major strategies that LGBTQ plus affirming Christians often use when combating these verses, or at least trying to interpret them. And then because I want this to have a practical goal, I want to make it the most practical goal for me in my own research, which is to think through the ways how we, either as church members or not as church members, can best support queer folks who have been attacked using these verses. 2 quick ground rules for this. What we won't be doing tonight is debating queer people's right to exist, using the Bible as a justification. I have done that enough with aunts and uncles, and I don't need to do it here. And the point here is that to put this in very church-friendly terms, I would like to approach this conversation reverently, with the understanding that queer folks are beloved children of God, created in the image of God, worthy of love, respect, and admiration. To put that in secular terms, we're going to approach this with the ground rule that no matter how we approach these verses, at the end of the day, queer people have the right to exist, the right to thrive, and the right to be celebrated by all of us as the fabulous unicorns that we are. Having laid those ground rules, let's talk about the verses. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly and just give a little bit of context for each. And if this is something that you already have heard, we're going to go through it fairly quickly. Unfortunately, these are verses that many queer folks, particularly queer Christians, have to learn very well, because these are the verses that are used to deny them church membership, to deny them marriage to the partner that they love within the bounds of the church, and even to do violence. Let's start with Genesis, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this story, for folks that have not read Genesis in a little bit, Abraham, the patriarch, is visited by 3 strangers who are probably angels, to talk about the sinful city of Sodom. Some of those angels go into the city to visit Abraham's nephew Lot, and they stay at Lot's house. And then that evening, the verse that I want to talk about comes in. Quote, "But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them.'" And by know them, the know is to signify rape or non-consensual sex. This is where we would get the term sodomy from, this idea that sex between people of the same sex, particularly between 2 men in this context, comes from a sort of particular interpretation of these verses from Genesis. We're going to talk about interpretations a little later, so I'm just going to move on, but this is the first one. The second 2 are from Leviticus. They are a part of several laws, a whole book of laws, several books of laws. There's a lot of law in Leviticus. And a lot of those laws relate to how humans, and particular the people of ancient Israel, are to relate to one another and to the world around them. And these 2 verses are in the 18th and 20th chapters of Leviticus. The first, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination." This is from 18. On all of these, I'm using the New Revised Standard Version translation of the Bible, and that will become important later. The second verse, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both have committed an abomination, they shall be put to death, their blood is upon them." again, we're gonna go over this, but I just want to introduce these verses in sort of a rapid fire way. Third, we're going to jump all the way to the New Testament, to the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans. In the first chapter, Paul is talking about immorality, particularly immorality among Gentiles, that is non-Jews. And Paul says the following, quote, "For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged the natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error." This, I think, is the most difficult of the 6 verses. This is also the one that was most frequently read to me in my adolescence. So I have a particular aversion for it, but in the same way that makes it good to approach, and I'm excited to be approaching it with you. The final 2 are in 1 Corinthians and also in 1 Timothy. They say pretty much similar things. These are both, again, traditionally written by the Apostle Paul, or traditionally attributed to Paul. And Paul gives a list of sinners, a list of wrongdoers. And let me read this one for you. And I'm not going to read Timothy because it's very similar. But let's read 1 Corinthians 6. "Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God. And this is what some of you used to be. But you were washed, you were sanctified, and you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God." 2 things here about this one. The words, the Greek words for male prostitutes and sodomites, or at least the words that are translated in that way, are often conflated in translations of the Bible to the umbrella term homosexual, which I'm going to rip apart in about 10 minutes. This particular translation separates them and translates the Greek words to male prostitutes and sodomites. This part down here, "and such were some of you, and this is what some of you used to be," is the verse most often used to justify conversion therapy, which does irreparable harm to queer youth and to queer adults and to queer everybody. It's awful. And should be banned in all states. I think it's only banned in 13 or 14 at the moment. Looking to get to all 50. I want to have a sort of mini reflection here, a moment to maybe share your thoughts. Hearing these verses, what's something you notice about them, or do you notice a pattern in the verses? So I'll stop my share for a minute so we can see each other. And again, I'll ask the questions of these 6 verses. What are some things you notice about them? And do you notice patterns? Feel free to unmute. Everyone is welcome to give their thoughts. I'm super comfortable with silence too. I can wait. Yes, okay, Cheryl has sent a chat, and chats are great as well. Right, they seem to focus more on males than females. The only one that is generally used as a biblical justification to attack lesbians or gay women or queer folk who identify as female is the Romans cluster of verses. You might have noticed also that none of these verses say anything about trans, gender nonconforming, or gender non-binary people. And I'm here to tell you that nowhere in the Bible does it say anything disparaging about transgender, gender nonconforming, and gender non-binary people. I would argue that the Bible alternatively has a lot of stories and a lot of passages that really speak highly of folks who live into what God wants them to be, and embrace the identity that God gave them. But again, this could be another hour-long conversation. So thank you, Cheryl, for that. Anyone else? Patterns, things you notice?
Well, some of it was like talking about definite non-consensual, which is a problem.
Right. So thank you, Maria. Maria and I went to high school together, and I'm so pleased that you're here. I'm pleased that everyone is here. So this is lovely. Yes. So a lot of them have to do particularly with the sex act as opposed to sort of attraction. Attraction comes up in the Romans verses, but it's sort of an attraction that seems non-consensual. Rape really factors heavily into the Sodom story. And when we think about Corinthians that talks about prostitution, often that also has a power dynamic that might not be interpreted in this context to be consensual. When the prostitutes in question were usually young men under the age of 16 who were working who were prostituting with much older men. Yeah. Maybe one more.
I think Emily just chatted something.
Emily did. You're allowed to say something too, though, Sarah, if you want to. No, it's okay. Emphasis on behavior that is damaging to the participant, self or other. Absolutely, Emily, you are correct. We see this obviously in particularly in Romans and in Genesis, but this also comes up in Timothy, in Corinthians, and to an extent in Leviticus. This is not this is not describing the kinds of behaviors that would be edifying or beneficial. I'm gonna go back to my PowerPoint. So let me share my screen again.
Benjamin, I think in the Old Testament, you see that they shall not lie as if with like a woman, right? Like, so it's not that they shouldn't lie with a man, they shouldn't lie with the man as if they were laying with a woman.
Right. There are a lot of things that people in Leviticus shall not do. And we only tend to care about this one, which is somewhat interesting. I have a video clip later, but absolutely, right. There is nuance there that is often ignored. The verse does not say thou shalt not lie with man, right? It says as with a woman. And there's a lot to be said here about biblical gender dynamics. The Bible, sorry about it, is not a wonderful resource to think about positive and affirming gender relations. We'll talk about that as well. But yeah, I want to move on to these strategies, and we can talk in the midst of these strategies. And always, if you have a comment, send a chat or just unmute and interrupt me. I am totally cool with that. The following strategies are things that I found in my research through interviews and through actually seeing it play out in people's conversations. And I've boiled them down to 4. Exegesis, content, morality, and love. And I'm going to explain what I mean by those and go through them one by one. First, let's talk about exegesis, or as I like to call it, the Inigo Montoya approach. Let me explain the meme on your page. Have most people seen the film The Princess Bride?
Yeah.
At some point? Watch it, very good, a classic. A young Robin Wright prior to House of Cards fame was in this film, as was here Mandy Patinkin and Wallace Shawn playing Vizzini and Inigo Montoya. Anyway, throughout the movie, the bald guy, Vizzini, keeps shouting the word inconceivable. And it doesn't really matter the context, it doesn't really matter what's happening. Vizzini just keeps shouting inconceivable. And at one point, Inigo Montoya can't stand it anymore and just says to Vizzini, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." This summarizes the first approach that I have found affirming Christians often use to combat these verses. Namely, this idea that we have either misinterpreted these verses, we have mistranslated them, or we don't have enough context of what they mean to justify harming people. So again, I want to point to the size of this book. This Bible is gigantic. If your justification from this whole book to harm or deny dignity to queer people is 6 verses, is that enough? My answer is no. Your answer might not be no. I would hope it is. But let's talk about some misinterpretations. And the first one I want to go to, let me go really quickly back to the verses from 1 Corinthians. And let's look at these 2 words, these 3 words actually, male prostitutes and sodomites. We're going to talk about Greek for just a minute. The words for those terms in Greek are right here, Malakoi and Arsenkoitai. These words don't show up a lot. Malakoi more often in ancient texts. Some believe that Paul came up with the word Arsenkoitai by himself because it shows up basically nowhere else except a few times in his letters, and this is the only time where it really sort of shows up. Malakos, the word from which Malakoi comes, means basically soft. It has been used in other places to describe rich fabrics that are soft, much like my soft cardigan that I currently find myself in. And again, if I were to say to you, that person is soft, would you immediately assume that that means that that person is either attracted to people of the same sex or engages in sex acts with people of the same sex? No. Malakos has been used in other places to certainly mean sort of susceptibility or subservience. Some sex and gender theorists have compared it to sort of malleability. They want you to think about something like butter or wet sand that you can really manipulate. That's why a lot of folks translate it to male prostitutes, this idea of young adolescent folks who are being used and abused and are sort of malleable to the desires of others, even if that desire is not reciprocated. But again, this is not a word that we know so well what it means that we want to base decades, if not centuries, of discrimination on. Arsenkoitai is even more difficult. Arsenkoitai is a conglomeration of 2 words, which basically are men and beds. So some people translate this to homosexuals, these 2 together, but you could say soft man beds. You could. And that sounds a bit vague, and it is a bit vague, right? We don't exactly know what these words mean. And we're sort of stuck in this particular misinterpretation where a large proportion of biblical readers and even many biblical scholars look at these words and think they mean a particular thing. And I want to give you the analogy of I don't know, I'm thinking of the old MacGyver TV show where he's like sort of looking at a bomb that has several wires that he needs to cut, and has an instruction manual that's sort of faded or in another language. Are we sure of these terms and their meanings? Are we sure enough that we would justify using them to harm people? The answer for me is no, but what the answer for me doesn't matter as much. I'm here to talk to you. What I'm saying is that these interpretations have consequences. They have physical ramifications on people's lives, their bodies, their material conditions. And those consequences are compounded by other forms of marginalization in the societies we find ourselves. So these misinterpretations of these verses compound with existing sexism, existing racism, existing ableism and ageism to visit violence and discrimination on folks with intersectional identities that that meet in a lot of those places. And I know some of my students from my current class are on this call, and I'm sorry I mentioned intersectionality again. If we were drinking, I would ask you to take a shot every time I say intersectionality. Don't break out the booze. This is not the time.
Too late.
What? Did someone say
Too late?
Yes! I adore that. That's wonderful. Anyway, what I'm saying here is that this strategy of pointing out these misinterpretations basically acknowledges this idea that Christians have a habit of letting some interpretations become fiercely defended pillars of their faith. But let's think about this. Someone has a chat for me. Oh, thank you, Jennifer. Let me ask you a question. What do the concept of the homosexual and the concept of the astronaut have in common? I'm gonna wait for at least one answer. So
They're both fly.
Beautiful. That's excellent. Not the answer that I was necessarily looking for, but I love it. Ha.
Out of this world.
Spacey, that is almost too clever. These are all very sweet. This is not what I'm looking for. Ostracized. I don't know how many astronauts are ostracized, Lainey. I mean, one of them is going to be a senator from Arizona, defeating many-time loser Martha McSally. Anyway, the thing that the homosexual and the astronaut have in common is that the contemporary audiences of the Bible would have no idea what you were talking about if you mentioned either of them. These concepts of this sort of spaceman and what we would now classify as homosexuality is not the kind of term that would make sense to a biblical audience. That's not to say that people were not attracted to people of the same sex in the contemporary moment in which the biblical books were being written. That's not to say that people in the times that the Bible was being written didn't have stories about people flying through the air as if they were astronauts. What I'm saying is that these particular concepts of homosexual and of astronaut are very similar in that they're not something that is part of that lexicon. Homosexuality is a loaded term, and it's sort of gone out of style in favor of something more encompassing like queerness. I prefer queer as a term over homosexual. But I know that for some on the call, that word has been used in their lifetimes as a pejorative. I've sort of reclaimed this, as have many, to use it in the affirmative. My point here, and the point of this whole rant, is that part of this misinterpretation strategy and thinking about the ways that the Bible has sort of been co-opted to meet particular ends is to recognize that the idea of making queer folks sort of fit within these verses is akin to trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It just was not meant to be. These verses were not meant in a way that would speak to contemporarily who we think of as the queer community. Again, the point of this strategy is not to have all the answers. People with years of biblical study, when put on the spot, often are not able to give point by point, bullet by bullet justifications of why these particular passages are misinterpreted. My hope, and my hope for you, if you use these strategies or if you think about these strategies, is that you think about it in the context of putting enough reasonable doubt into people's minds. If their interpretations are really solid enough to justify violence and discrimination. Do you really know the Bible that well that you would be comfortable doing that? These interpretations have ramifications. And to give you an example of this, I want to show you my first prop. Does anybody know who this is?
Mm-hmm.
Got a long beard. He's holding some tablets. He's seated. He looks very regal. Much like someone Charlton Heston would play in a film. Okay, this
Was
is
he
Moses.
the first dude to upload from the cloud on tablets or something?
No, this is Moses.
Yes, I know.
The
That's why I'm
star of
kidding
the
you.
books of Exodus, Leviticus,
Right.
Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This is a copy of a statue of Moses by the sculptor Michelangelo. It sits in a church in Rome. I want you to look at his head. He's got horns.
I thought I was seeing horns.
Do you see the horns?
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to tell you why he has horns. This is relevant. In Exodus, there is a passage where Moses comes down off of the mountain with the tablets, and there are beams of light emanating from his head. This verse, for a very long time, was mistranslated. Instead of beams of light, it was translated as horns. So when you see Renaissance sculptures like this one or paintings of Moses, do this on your own time. Do some Googling of images of Moses prior to the sort of prior to the Reformation, let's say, prior to the mass printing of the Bible. You're gonna see horns on his head. Sometimes he has these big, like, curvy ram horns. This is a mistranslation. Our translations of the Bible are fallible. Now, this mistranslation to give Moses horns didn't really result in anyone dying, losing their job, or otherwise. At least I don't think so. However, aren't we doing sort of the same thing? Aren't our own misinterpretations of particular passages causing harm to particular people? And I'm not saying that you're misinterpreting. I'm saying sort of we writ large societally. So again, definitely Google Moses with horns. Going back to my PowerPoint. The next strategy I want to talk about is context. And here we're going to talk about Leviticus. I'm not actually going to talk about Leviticus. Martin Sheen is going to talk to you about Leviticus. This is the West Wing approach. And for folks who watched The West Wing, you might know the clip I'm about to show you. It's about 3 minutes long, and it has to do with biblical interpretation. I'm gonna pause the recording. Anywho, now that the recording has started again, I'm not going to share any of my bad jokes, and we'll continue with the PowerPoint. let me share my screen again. Anyway, this strategy that's really sort of most exemplified here is a strategy of invoking context. This is also often called the cherry picking argument. Essentially, this is an accusation that is often leveled at pro-LGBT Christians. You'll see folks with an anti-LGBT bent saying, you know, they're picking and choosing the verses that they want to read. My advice is to turn that strategy right around and throw that right back and say, you know, this can also apply to an anti-LGBT worldview. This is a big book. I'm going to say it again. It is nearly impossible to take into account all 30-some thousand verses equally. It is natural to put some emphasis on some over others. However, again, as I'm saying many times through this presentation, if the result of reading particular verses in particular ways causes harm, we need to ask, why are those verses being overemphasized? And why are certain other verses not being emphasized? If anti-LGBT Christians scrutinize Leviticus 18:22, prohibiting a man lying with a man as with a woman, why is the rest of Leviticus not placed under this equal scrutiny? A lot of people will make the shrimp argument here, or the crab argument, the shellfish, right? The rules about not wearing clothing made of different fabrics, definitely sinning there right now. Planting two crops in the same field. There are many of these, and they happen. These prohibitions happen in the New Testament as well. Paul really doesn't like gold jewelry. He doesn't like men to have long hair. And all of our pictures of Jesus tend to give him this long hair that Paul doesn't like. Interesting. What I'm saying is that to neglect this equal scrutiny places an unequal emphasis on certain biblical passages at the expense of downplaying or ignoring other verses that might complicate or contradict those arguments. So again, it probably is not a good strategy if someone is debating you on scripture to say, well, you're just cherry picking. But introducing this in a bit more sort of soft or subtle way might be helpful. The third approach that a lot of folks I worked with took was what I called the Paul was wrong approach. And this is the most controversial of the four, I think, among any fundamentalist colleagues that I may run into, because it points out that there are parts of the Bible that are just not so great. And by that I mean that there are scriptural passages in this very, very large book that appear to advocate for or condone or glorify, among other things, violence, rape, slavery, misogyny, genocide, and ableism. And that's just, that's just a couple of the things, right? Forms of colonialism, of imperialism, of racism, and of sexism have been justified through scripture. It was another presentation I was giving about 2 months ago for some Presbyterians, and we were talking about the process of unlearning interpretations of these verses and hoping for a day when folks wouldn't preach these verses from pulpits in a way to disenfranchise and attack queer people. And we talked about how something very similar was done in many, many American pulpits in the 17th, 18th, and at least half of the 19th century to justify enslavement and to justify the subjugation of women, and to continue to put down particular marginalized folks, or to justify colonialism, or to justify imperialism, or to justify armed conflict. There are many places here where if the text itself isn't wrong, the interpretation is leading to great wrong. And I understand that that is not a super popular argument. I think there is a way to appreciate these documents and also recognize their flaws. For folks that take offense to this, I often liken it to the US Constitution as a document that people tend to like a whole lot, but there are parts of that Constitution that are also really problematic and that also justify particular forms of violence and particular forms of marginalization. And so we have to think about it sort of in that context. My fourth approach is my Lady Gaga approach, the love approach. This is the one that among my research participants was the most popular. Although of the 95 people I interviewed, only one quoted Lady Gaga to me because she knew who I was and how to reach me where I live. Lady Gaga, of course, released the track Born This Way in, I believe, 2011. This was an affirming anthem in particular for LGBTQ folks, and includes the lyric, I'm beautiful in my way because God makes no mistakes. This is a strategy that was often used by folks in my research, a strategy of really, really pointing out that there are certain paradigms, certain commands in the Bible that supersede the rest, that really encompass the whole point of what we're doing here. And the one that they most often pointed to were Jesus's teachings. I'm going to draw them from Matthew, that the greatest commandment is to love God and love neighbor. On these two hang all the law and the prophets, right? These are particular commands that are believed to be sort of overarching. So when we think about this, what does it mean to love God and neighbor? For some, loving God and loving neighbor are interchangeable and simultaneous. This is particularly true in certain denominations, not limited to Protestant denominations. My point here is that care and devotion towards one's neighbor, in this case, queer neighbors, is intrinsically tied, sorry, my screen froze, is intrinsically tied to love for and worship of God, which is key to dutiful Christian vocation. So again, my point here is that this particular strategy gives an opportunity to not ignore the parts of the Bible that we may not like, but to say that there are particular parts of the Bible that, if not supersede, I don't like the word supersede, words that sort of summarize, again, what we're doing here, summarize why we would take the time to read this and make this an important part of life. But I want to take some time now to just have a discussion. And I have a few sort of questions to get us started in discussion. And feel free to participate in ways that are most comfortable for you. What strategies for sort of approaching these verses resonate with you? Where are some gaps or some problem areas that you may have? And how do you think that we, and I'm going to assume a we, as people who recognize the humanity, validity, and belovedness of queer folk, how we can have conversations with people about not using these verses in a way that is violent, in a way that is marginalizing. Joyce, I think you're muted.
A great discussion, thank you. The thoughts that popped in my head, and at any Bible study we have, it's first of all, the Bible was written by men, so it's not like it was penned in heaven and floated down. So, and then I always view the words of the apostles or the disciples or the prophets even similar to our current pastors. You're taking interpretations of what you think, you know, Jesus or God intended us to be in the world he's made. And then I like to cherry pick also not only the ones love your neighbor, but all the ones about judging, you know. I mean, you know, the verses about not judging, don't judge somebody else or you will be judged, or, you know, you might think you're right, you know, but, you know, God's the ultimate judge. So if you want to cherry pick, you can cherry pick anything, like you were just saying, whether it's slavery or divorce or, you know, what West Wing was saying. I don't have them right off my hand like he does, but, you know, yeah, you have to look at the Bible in the totality and in the context. And judging somebody, you know, it's not who we're supposed to do, not what we're supposed to do.
Right. What's the saying? Remove the plank from your own eye before you remove the speck from your neighbor's eye, your brother's eye. Brother is gendered in a way, your sibling's eye. Someone left. Oh, it was Elizabeth, sorry. Now she's forever called out for having to go to her other event on this recorded chat. Don't tell her. Yeah. Other thoughts, responses?
I feel like I am not Bible steeped. I mean, I've read it. I love the message, but I got to back away and concentrate on the love and the action. So I feel like I'm probably not even a good candidate for being part of your discussion, because I'm sort of backing away from, you know, a lot of traditional stuff. So, I mean, you know, talk about a reason to hurt people. What? There is never, ever a reason to hurt people. What the cluck are we talking about? So, I get a little hot, a little heated,
Yeah.
about reasons to hurt people. No,
As we all should.
there is no room for that here. Sorry, go ahead.
And I promise, Wendy, that I wasn't mad at you about the joke. No, but I think that it is really, if you're gonna have a conversation with people about this topic, which matters deeply to a lot of people, right? If you're gonna have this conversation, it is particularly, I keep losing and gaining my hosting privileges here. It is completely within your purview as a discussant, as someone being part of this, to frame it in this way. Is your belief here or your interpretation strong enough to justify for you the harming of people? Not just affecting their material conditions, but doing literal violence to their bodies. And that sounds harsh, but those are the stakes of this argument.
Right.
And we should be upset about it, right? I see a comment from Aaron, but I see Ruth, you have your hand up too. Aaron writes, I've always gone with the cherry picking because to me it's the most logical argument. However, I liked hearing the other approaches because it does tend to be a conversation stopper. It is a conversation stopper, absolutely. I accidentally threw someone out of the waiting room. Hold on. I'm a monster. Anyway, Ruth, you had a point.
So I'm reminded by what often accompanies conversations, discussions between people about what does the Bible say and interpretations of those verses. A lot of times the justification or explanation that is given by someone, especially if they're sort of saying why it's okay to be in some ways exclusionary, is the saying, love the sinner but hate the sin. And I'm always been bothered by that, because it seems that it's very difficult to do both at the same time, and that the behavior often reflects not loving the sinner, but hating the sinner as well as hating the sin. And that's what I find troubling. But I think that, I think people, when you're trying to have a conversation with someone about how you interpret the Bible on these kinds of issues, that, you know, you run into these additional arguments, because I think it's difficult sometimes for people to really deal honestly with the way they feel, and maybe a bit defensive about their belief in the cherry picking verses that they rely on as a basis for their viewpoint.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, Ruth. And I have heard love the sinner, hate the sin more times than if I had a nickel for every time, right? I could afford a better apartment and I could give you all better apartments. And generally when someone says love the sinner, hate the sinner, they've never, love the sinner, hate the sin. They've never really conceived of themselves as the sinner. They've always conceived of themselves as the lover or the hater. They're always in that position of power. So I will often ask, if I have the courage to, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I don't have the bandwidth to respond like this. But when I'm feeling particularly bold, I'll say, what was the situation in your life where someone told you they loved you, but they hated your sin? And the person will usually say, well, that has never happened. Yeah, because this love the sinner, hate the sin sort of sounds like it's this broad thing that applies to a bunch of stuff, but it's really only used in practice to make queer people feel bad about themselves.
Yeah.
There are other sort of incidents where that has been used, but it gets used most often sort of as this cudgel to clobber queer people. So again, I'm looking at all these chats, so many chats. Oh, and thank you to Julie for your comment. And Lainey made a comment. I can really appreciate the discussion about the homosexual not being part of the lexicon at those times. It's hard for a lot of Christians, I know, to grasp because we're so focused on the here and now. Right. And again, I think I assume that everyone who's currently on the call is somewhere within the continental United States. And there are parallels to be drawn in the way that we think about the Bible to the way that we think about the US Constitution. That there are some who believe that, you know, we now have another originalist on the court, right? Who believes that we have to go with sort of the letter of the Constitution and the circumstances don't change. And even if these categories, but again, let's think about the framers of the Constitution and think about astronauts. There were no astronauts in the 1700s. So if you're an originalist, how do you account for astronauts? How do you account for Instagram? How do you account for COVID-19? These are all things that like did not exist and are not part of the lexicon. And that's not to say, oh, they were unprepared. It just wasn't there. So again, when we think about human sexuality and human capacity to feel affection or desire, these capacities to feel attraction, love, and desire existed in the ancient world, but they existed and they played out in very different ways And I say this, before I did anthropology, I was a classical archaeologist. I did a lot of work with the Roman and pre-Roman worlds, and focused a lot on religion and sexuality. Shocking, because now I still focus on religion and sexuality. But I think it is almost impossible to have a good understanding of what the Bible says about sexuality without understanding what sexuality looked like in the context in which the Bible was written. As you said, Joyce, this didn't just fall out of the sky. It developed in a context. It developed with people who were having particular relationships with people at particular times. And I do this where I just rant and rant, and I'm so sorry. I did it again. Other folks. Maddie, you're looking very officious with your very full bookshelf behind you.
It doesn't mean a thing.
I disagree. Other thoughts?
I have a question. This might be a different direction than you're wanting to go, but I'm wondering, I don't know, there's like a couple of different ways that we kind of look at some of the problematic texts in the Bible as like theologians and stuff. And this is kind of one of those ways where we're reclaiming these texts. And then some other folks have talked about the cherry picking or sometimes tossing out things that are hurtful or whatever. I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about queer theology and kind of like looking at other texts with like a queer lens and kind of giving power back, I think, to the queer community and queer theologians and Christians everywhere, if you have a chance or desire to talk about that at all.
Yeah, I think that is a wonderful segue. And what really I want to answer, but I want to say what really interested me in my research was that a lot of the people I worked with really weren't there in terms of sort of reading things through a queer lens and reclaiming a lot of it. It was really a lot of sort of being on the defensive. And a lot of what we talked about in those years when my opinion was asked for, when we were having conversations, was that it's okay to sort of go, I wish I had a better term for go on the offense, but as you said, sort of reclaim the scripture and the sort of joyful interpretation of it. I would like to get to a point as people who like the Bible, be they Christian or not, where we read it with the intent of celebrating queer people rather than defending queer people. And I encourage you to do that as you're reading the Bible the next time, and you're thinking about how it's going to affect your life, thinking about not necessarily how will I use this to defend someone, but how will I use this to celebrate someone, and to point out the kinds of gifts and potentialities that are there. There are several theologians that I really like in the context of the ELCA and of the sort of Lutheran orbit. And since we're Lutheran sort of centric right now, I'll tell you that the theologians that I'm reading and that I'd like you to read too are Austin Hartke and Lenny Duncan. These are two titans right now of queer Lutheran theology, who both talk about, and I am greatly compressing their theses down right now. Please read their work. I'm gonna put them in the chat right now, and you can do some Googling. Actually, where's the chat? Yes. Austin Hartke and Lenny Duncan. But what I love about Hartke's work is that Hartke talks a lot about what I just said, of sort of moving beyond unapologetic on behalf of queer people, moving beyond a defense and moving to this sort of affirmation, this sort of celebration, and acknowledging the kinds of gifts that queer people bring to the church and to society at large, that are uniquely queer. And then what I love many things about Lenny Duncan's work, but Lenny Duncan is a super strong voice for this sort of affirmation to go further, to go from affirmation to liberation and to atonement, and to restorative practices, and even to reparation. That there are ways in which we as a community, be we a Christian community or a secular community, think about the ways that we can atone for our societal sins. Racism is a societal sin if you're thinking about it from a Christian lens, as is homophobia, as is transphobia. Anyway, I don't know if I answered your question. I think I did a polemic there.
You did. That was helpful. Because I think that there comes a time when apologetics is like just tiring and exhausting. And it's like, okay, I'm done like fighting for my right as a queer person to exist in this church. And like, I'm going to go find people that are going to celebrate me, even if I have to like pave the way. But, Queer Virtue, that's a really great book to read. Elle Dowd is writing a new book right now as well. And she's a great person to follow as well. But yeah, I think this is so important because we get hung up on 6 verses. And I mean, so much so that we have to devote multiple times, a month to sit together and talk about these verses and to reassure people that they're still wanted here. So I think this is important work that you're doing. And also want to encourage people to continue like Lenny does, liberating us.
Right. Absolutely. And again, I'm at once sort of heartened and eager when I encounter these communities that are making attempts to be affirming, in that they are in the place where they want to make those apologetics and they want to get good at them. But as you said, I think there comes a point where we also need to move beyond that. Because in a lot of affirming churches now, we have this wonderful thing, which is that there are queer parishioners and parishioners who are living openly. And now, again, not to trivialize it, but like queer people are special unicorns. We're kind of better in many ways. And there's a way that queer people can invigorate and can just bring so much potential that has been crushed and has been discounted for far too long. I look forward to a sort of flowering of queer theology in the next 2 decades. I think right now I'm seeing too much. I'm seeing too many memoirs by white gay evangelicals. They were good in sort of way paving in a way, but I want more. I want it to get more liberationist. I want it to be more intersectional. A lot of those works that are relatively new have pretty archaic gender and racial politics that I'm not super okay with. But again, I gave you the names of 2 authors that I really like. If you want more, send me an email and we can talk.
It strikes me, this is long after the question was posed, way back at the beginning of your presentation, after you presented the 6 verses, and then you asked the question, well, what do you notice about these verses? And, are there patterns or what? And it's taken me all this time. My brain's been working, but I think kind of slowly tonight, that one thing that's noticeable, none of those verses, they're not things that Jesus said. They're what other people said in the Bible, but it's not what Jesus said.
Right. And Joyce wrote, enjoying Bishop Curry's new book, Love is the Way. We could use more of a lens of love right now. Michael Curry is great and worth listening to. And this is a plug for a different denomination, and I really apologize, Lutherans. But Bonnie Perry, the new Episcopal Bishop of Michigan, gives some pretty kick-ass sermons on Sunday morning, and they're all virtual. So you can have your cake and eat it too, and like still be Lutherans and listen to an Episcopal sermon. You're in full communion, so like God will not be mad. No, Ruth, to your point, I think that for people that I worked with was really the core, that it was sort of like, we read all this stuff, but it's not stuff that was a priority of Jesus. Jesus had time to curse a fig tree and had time to turn water into wine and, you know, take naps on a boat. If he wanted to say something nasty about queer people, he would have had time, right? And that sounds really flippant, but I think it's worth noting that there's a lot that has been said, and none of it really has to do with the things that Jesus said about sex and sexuality. Was that it needed to be sort of mutually honoring between people, that it shouldn't be exploitative, essentially. And none of that sounds anti-queer to me. It sounds frankly very affirming. And you know, this is again, I'm gonna sound like I'm advocating for the supremacy of queer people, and I might be. But queer people are often better at a lot of these things. Think about all the extra hoops that queer people have to jump through to get married, to adopt a kid, to visit each other in the hospital. I'll tell you, queer people often have a better understanding of this book because it's been used to hurt them. And you kind of have to know where it's coming from. I read it cover to cover in high school, and it was not pleasant. A lot of begetting and a lot of war and a lot of Paul just sort of rambling, but I did it. I read the whole thing. So that I'll tell that story later. But yeah, and that's a kind of mastery of the material, or just awareness of the material, that can be celebrated. Imagine having folks with that kind of knowledge in a Bible study or in a class, and for so long queer people have been told this is not a place for you to participate. Probably because the heterosexuals know we would just do it better. No, I'm kidding. I do believe that, but in a very non-threatening way to everybody else. I think, but I make this joke, and I want to say this to be slightly vulnerable with you, as a queer presenter who has not always had the best relationship with religious institutions, that there comes a time when queer people need to celebrate their queerness as well, right? And to go beyond that point of apologetic and go into celebration in our own right, as people and as people that can make really important contributions. So this is a sort of exercise in self-affirmation as well as it should be. I would be interested, have people had conversations with other folks that are less or non-affirming about these topics? Is it something that you have had an opportunity to do, or is it something that doesn't come up? I'm legitimately curious. I don't know the answer.
I think I just tend to hang around like-minded people, so it doesn't really come up. But
Jennifer says yes.
Monique just said yes too.
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course I have, yeah.
Yeah.
I have when I took a class in seminary with the Catholic seminary. And so the fact that I was a woman in this class, but also a queer woman in a class with four top people from each of the seminaries. And there was a Baptist seminary and a Presbyterian seminary and all this. And at the Catholic seminary, there are 4 men that are, studying to be priests. And that whole thing that Ruth, was that you that said about, Jesus never said any of this came up. And, then the whole Jesus is completely perfect thing. And then the whole, okay, could Jesus explain quantum mechanics to us and quantum physics and whatever? Because Jesus was a human being in his time and place and understood the context of his time. And he did not speak to the context of our day today, but that is just so hard for people who have been taught that the Bible is completely infallible and is the word of God that was dropped from the, from the heavens or whatever, into our lap. And I don't know what you do with that. Sometimes there is no making, a common connection and trying to work through it.
Right. I don't know if Jesus could have explained quantum mechanics. When I'm in that conversation, I usually talk about that time that Jesus called the Syrophoenician woman a dog and was like, Jesus was not always on his A game either. We love him, absolutely, but just not, there is a human element to this as well. The comments are blowing up right now. Lainey, unfortunately, it comes up at family gatherings. At my family gatherings too, I've become really good at deflection. And yeah, Erin, it's easier to come out as queer in the church for me now than it is to come out as a Christian in the LGBTQ plus community. Could you say more about that? If you're comfortable. Or could you type more about that? I have a couple times, it usually ended with a person telling me, I still love you, I just think it's wrong, and we move on. Yeah, that's happened too. None of this sounds unfamiliar. And I think that that's kind of a part of the story of having these conversations. It is, a pastor once likened it for me to climbing a rock climbing wall, that people sort of view their interpretations of particular verses as a handhold on this wall. And they're worried that if they take their hand away, they're going to fall. And there's a certain amount of fragility there, right? This point of sort of being sort of existentially lost isn't necessarily doing physical violence in the way that physical violence has been done to queer people. But it is important to think about the way that that people are unwilling to part with that worldview because they're clinging to it so strongly. It just came up last week. I was talking about SCOTUS and how they don't just decide on things like abortion and gay marriage. And I was talking about how much SCOTUS matters. Anyway, this person said he didn't believe in either because the Bible said, and I just filed that away and asked a queer clergy person in my life how she responded when people say being gay is against the Bible. And she gave me some great resources, and here I am. And welcome, we're so happy to have you. Yeah, I think the parallels between the Bible and the Constitution and the way that people cling to them in ways that are sort of unhealthy for them and for others is interesting. Sarah writes, yeah, these interpretations are often really deeply held, which is strange to me because it's often deeply held by people that aren't personally affected by it. And in a conversation I had last week, it seemed like the person didn't want to give any way on these verses because deep down they knew it would mean that they would have to rethink their whole approach to biblical interpretation. Exactly, right? If that handhold goes away, you suddenly fall, or at least that's the perception. And this is the place where I sound not particularly nurturing because my response is generally, is that such a bad thing? And that might be the sort of jaded academic talking where I'm like, it's okay to be so open-minded that you would have to rethink some of your worldview. I think the stakes of this are high enough that people should be open to that. Again, I think of the religious questions that people have fought wars over and literally set each other on fire for, and you know, like the position of the sun relative to the earth, and whether the sun actually stopped when Joshua told it to in the Old Testament, and things like this. And these huge things are like, does Moses have horns? He doesn't. His statue does. And this is one of the coolest ornaments I have in my apartment. But I figured the best chance of changing minds is just living my life. These perceptions are often held by those not deeply affected by it because they haven't been forced to rethink it. Right, I think that's true. Sometimes I think that people haven't been forced, or they've been in a position where they should have, where they could have taken that opportunity and sort of further close off. I can speak to various people in my own family where that is kind of the case, that something has been presented and there's sort of a retraction. But right, there's often a place where there's often a place where that happens. I have to go back to Aaron's comment about coming out as a Christian in the LGBTQ community. I was on a Zoom date last week and I noted that I was technically a card-carrying Lutheran, and then was asked to give a biblically grounded sexual ethic. And I was like, I'm not ready to do this. I'm just like here to talk about movies and possibly books, but not that. Anyway, a bit of levity to the end of our conversation. Who wants to have the final word? Because we are at 8:30. I'm willing to stick around for a few more minutes if folks want to talk, but I am mindful of the time.
My only final comment would be, I'd rather not get into the weeds with people. I'd rather just say, you know, I think the Bible talks more about love than hate. So I think I'm just going to, you know, say I think I'll choose the path of love. I'm not going to be the one to judge. You know, and I agree with those other comments. It does seem a lot of times it's people, especially abortion. And as a nurse that worked in a neonatal intensive care unit, you know, it's like people that have some really strong feeling. It's like you've never seen a small little fetus or a small little infant or a premature baby or had, you know, pregnancy complications. I mean, and yet you have this strong feeling that you want to restrict somebody else. And it's the same with, you know, sexual orientation. It's like, that's not up for you to judge. It's like, yeah.
And I think a lot of times these issues are sort of analogous in the way that they're thought about in the abstract. That people think of these issues as Supreme Court decisions, or think about them as legislation or of referendums. And don't think about how individual people are living into, in this case, what I'm thinking about more is sort of queerness, but it applies to a lot of these other issues that are very divisive, and prompt a lot of sort of conversation that is not always resolvable. Yeah. I, again, want to be mindful of the time because it was 90 minutes. So I will be around for a few more minutes, but I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who was here for being part of this discussion. This is a super important topic. It's only something that is going to be, I think, more within our consciousness. Moving forward, and this is something that we don't have to be. I am certainly not a biblical scholar. I'm not I speak fundamentalist, but I'm not a good chapter and verser. and that's okay. You can have a commitment to defending and affirming and celebrating and queering Christianity and religious institutions in general, and not have an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible. But I encourage you to think about the ways that will work for you, and to think about the ways that we can work on this affirming work together. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.